They had lost 3 systems in as many weeks. Entire planets swallowed in silence, cut off before distress calls could finish broadcasting. The Galactic Accord, proud and ancient, found itself cornered. Centuries of diplomacy, research, and peacekeeping had not prepared them for the Tyrannex swarm. They were not an empire, they were a hunger. They did not speak, negotiate, or retreat. They consumed. Command posts overflowed with panic. Strategic committees met in constant crisis. Fleets fell back, regrouped, then fractured again. Nothing worked. The Accord's finest military minds admitted, behind closed doors, that they were facing extinction. Their tactics were elegant, their technology superior on paper. But none of it mattered. The Tyrannex adapted faster than theory accounted for. They outnumbered, overwhelmed, and outlasted. The Accord's member species, each brilliant in their own domains, found themselves fundamentally unprepared for war on this scale. The Avok were philosophers, the Nurethi tacticians, the Gelvani innovators. But none of them were predators. Their societies had evolved past violence millennia ago. Even their weapons were built for precision, not brutality. Now, facing an enemy that operated purely on instinct, precision was a liability. Diplomacy was irrelevant. Ethics outdated. In desperation, the Accord searched its margins. In forgotten files and red-flagged archives, they unearthed one name: Earth. A death world. A violent, unstable planet quarantined from diplomatic consideration due to its hostile biosphere and the erratic temperament of its dominant species, humans. Earth had been offered Accord membership once. It had declined. Since then, it had been left alone. Too unpredictable. Too volatile. But now, that volatility was beginning to look like the only advantage left. The word circulated through military channels with uneasy tension: contact them. Not officially. Not through the Council. Quietly. Desperately. The message sent was simple. Not a demand. A plea. Reinforcements were needed, any who would come. The reply came quickly, far quicker than anyone anticipated. We'll send troops. There was no ceremony, no fanfare. No diplomatic overture or conditions. Just coordinates. Timelines. And a warning. Clear the landing zones. We're coming in hot. At first, the other species waited in morbid curiosity. They'd seen the files. Earth's fauna alone had a higher lethality index than some planetary militaries. Its weather patterns were classified as low-level natural disasters. But still, how could a single planet offer what the entire Accord could not? The first human ships arrived without announcement. Not standard diplomatic vessels, but massive, armored transports bristling with weapons, hulls scorched and patched. They landed hard, like they were daring the ground to resist them. No ornamentation. No insignia beyond a black skull marked into the steel with crude paint. And then the doors opened. What stepped out were not peacekeepers. Not soldiers in the traditional sense. They were too rough. Uniforms varied by unit, weapons were modded beyond regulation, and their eyes held a weight that unsettled even battle-hardened officers. These were people shaped by survival, not order. They carried scars like medals and moved like predators, silent, calculated, efficient. There was no wasted motion. No hesitation. They barely acknowledged the non-human officers sent to greet them. One of them laughed at a nervous attempt to brief them on the local terrain. "We don't need a map," he said. "We'll figure it out on the way back." From the first engagement, it became obvious that humans fought differently. Where other soldiers held lines, humans created chaos. They didn't follow conventional strategies. They struck fast, broke formations, and disappeared into the terrain. Reports came in of small squads operating days beyond communication, returning with intel, trophies, and enemy heads. They didn't wait for commands. They didn't ask permission. They acted, adapted, and annihilated. In one battle, a human fire team used unstable power cells to create a chain reaction explosion, taking out an entire Tyrannex column. The tactic had a success probability of 12%. They never hesitated. To the Accord's forces, humans were both saviors and enigmas. They joked in the face of death, played music during bombardments, and painted symbols on their armor like ancient warriors. Some were terrifying. Others seemed oddly kind. But all of them were effective. The galactic officers tried to coordinate with them, issue commands, apply structure. The humans responded with nods, shrugs, or silence, and then did what they wanted anyway. But the results were undeniable. Battlefronts stabilized. Supply lines re-established. For the first time, the Tyranics showed hesitation. Human commanders didn't share plans. They shared objectives. "We need this ground." "Then it's ours." That was the extent of the briefing. Their language was simple, brutal, and always direct. The Accord had called for reinforcements. What they got were Deathworlders. They came like a storm. No parades. No banners. Just the deafening roar of engines and the grind of metal on landing pads. Human transports hit the ground like weapons themselves, hulls battered, weapons active, not waiting for orders. The ships were ugly, practical, brutal, and heavily scarred. They looked less like military vessels and more like survivors of 1,000 battles. And the soldiers that emerged from them fit the same mold. They were tall, muscular, armored in mismatched gear patched with local scrap and reinforced plating. Helmets painted with snarling beasts' skulls' eyes. No two were alike. They moved with unsettling unity, not through discipline, but through instinct. They didn't salute. They didn't announce their presence. They simply moved toward the fight. To the alien commanders, it was jarring. Protocols were ignored. Tactical briefings were shrugged off. A Nurethi officer tried issuing orders, only to be met with a flat stare and the answer, "Noted." The human squad deployed minutes later, not to the designated location, but somewhere they deemed more useful. Within an hour, enemy numbers in that sector dropped by half. The way they fought defied every doctrine in the Accord's archives. They didn't hold formations, they scattered and surrounded. They didn't advance with caution, they sprinted headlong into cover fire, responding with grenades, drones, smoke, and blades. Their tactics were constantly shifting. One minute they were snipers. The next, close-quarter shock troops. They adapted so fast that command structures couldn't keep up. Their gear was loud, patched, and often non-standard. Some wore trophies, claws from slain Tyranics, bits of armor from fallen comrades, beads, bones, chains. To some aliens, it looked savage. But when they saw a single human dragging 2 wounded allies while shooting one-handed, those trinkets took on new meaning. These weren't mercenaries. They were packs. Even the way they communicated was foreign. Radios crackled with slang and inside jokes. They used hand signals, single glances, subtle movements. They spoke in short bursts. No one wasted breath. In the heat of combat, they were silent killers. Afterward, they laughed like maniacs, shared flasks, told stories of worse days. In one sector, a forward operating base was nearly overrun. Reinforcements were too far. Human squads arrived instead. In under 20 minutes, the attackers were routed. When the Accord forces emerged, they found the humans playing cards, gear still steaming from combat, blood spattered across their armor. One was humming a song. Another cleaned his weapon like it was an old friend. The non-human soldiers were stunned. This wasn't courage. It was something else. Humans seemed immune to fear. They treated war as work, dangerous, ugly, but manageable. Some alien medics noticed it too. Human vitals under stress were off the charts, heart rates that would kill other species. But they pushed forward unfazed. Pain thresholds, endurance, raw reaction time, they outclassed the average Accord soldier by orders of magnitude. Rumors spread quickly. Of humans taking on entire Tyranics nests alone. Of a squad leader who dragged his wounded team 5 kilometers while fighting off stragglers. Of a woman who rigged her own severed arm to a drone and used it to detonate enemy munitions. Nothing was confirmed, but no one doubted it. They ate strange food, laughed in the middle of bombardments, and told newcomers, "It's not that bad," even when half their unit was gone. They weren't cold, They were used to it. War was not new to them. It was their environment. And they thrived in it. Accord officers began requesting humans by name. Aliens who once feared them asked to be stationed near them. Human presence meant survival odds tripled. They worked without complaint, without ego. They only demanded ammunition, fuel, and room to move. The Tyrannics reacted too. Their advance slowed. Their formations shifted. Hive leaders began relocating, as if sensing a predator too dangerous to face head-on. They adapted to many things, but not this. Human behavior on the battlefield broke all conventional analysis. They flanked when flanking was suicidal. They charged when retreat was expected. They created traps, improvised weapons, and psychological warfare with no formal training. They used enemy corpses as warnings, messages, sometimes even shields. Not because they were cruel, because it worked. To the Accord, it was a revelation. They had asked for soldiers. What they received were Deathworlders who walked like executioners and smiled through blood. They didn't just fight, they adapted faster than the war could change. Deathworlders didn't follow instructions. They studied, altered, and rewrote every battlefield rule with ruthless efficiency. Where the Accord relied on symmetry and logic, humans introduced unpredictability. Every mission, every engagement became a laboratory for violence. They turned survival into an art form. Tyrannics learned to fear the terrain. Not because it was hostile, but because humans made it worse. Ravines became kill zones, forests transformed into explosive traps. Human engineers didn't just repair, they weaponized. They converted broken machinery into mines, stripped crashed enemy craft for parts, and used alien bodies to create grotesque but effective decoys. Nothing was wasted. Everything could be turned lethal. Standard Issue was a suggestion. They modified energy weapons with scavenged components, fused alien batteries to boost output beyond safe limits. It worked. Sometimes the weapons overloaded, but by then the target was gone. Ammunition shortages didn't stop them. They built makeshift launchers, threw magnetic knives, attached explosives to drones made from enemy tech. Their ingenuity terrified analysts. They didn't need superiority, they needed opportunity. One team infiltrated a Tyrannics nest using scent masking gel derived from their own dead. They walked into the hive and detonated a pulse bomb at the center, collapsing the tunnel system. No one had considered infiltration even possible. For humans, impossible was simply something untested. Tactics were fluid. In open combat, they zigzagged between conventional and psychological warfare. They mimicked distress signals to lure Tyrannics into ambushes, hacked into enemy sensors to project false troop movements, even painted corpses to resemble live targets to confuse targeting systems. Their operations created illusions, distractions, and chaos. They weren't just killing, they were unhinging the swarm's neural patterns. Human commanders didn't demand loyalty, they earned it by walking through fire with their soldiers. They led charges, carried wounded, fought hand-to-hand when necessary. They weren't above any task. Their unit cohesion wasn't structured by rank but by respect forged under fire. Discipline came from trust, not protocol. They didn't just expect results. They delivered them without compromise. They trained while injured, studied during rest, and built kill maps between missions. Each battle improved them. They absorbed data at a speed unmatched by any Accord algorithm. Even their downtime was strategic. They analyzed footage, replayed enemy movements, and simulated weaknesses. They didn't recover, they prepared. Allied officers stopped asking for reports. Instead, they just followed the smoke trails. Where humans passed, Tyrannics territory turned to rubble. Entire command clusters vanished. Swarm formations lost direction. One hive node was found dissected, its internal systems mapped and marked with human code symbols. No one claimed responsibility. No one had to. When asked how they did it, one human replied, "We grew up on a planet that tried to kill us every day. This is just practice." Tyrannics started hesitating. They began rerouting paths to avoid human zones. Retreats were observed for the first time. They feared being isolated by human hunters, small groups that roamed autonomously, dismantling entire supply chains. These operatives didn't seek victory in numbers. They struck weak points with clinical violence, vanishing before counterstrikes could form. Allies who once doubted now watched with silent awe. They'd seen humans dive into collapsing tunnels to rescue strangers, tear apart drop ships to create shelters, and hold lines alone until reinforcements arrived. Deathworlders weren't efficient because of superior resources. They were efficient because failure had never been a tolerable outcome. Earth didn't reward second chances. Even enemy prisoners, once captured, displayed signs of stress when interrogated about human encounters. The swarm began to shift its hive logic. Encounters with humans led to erratic behavior and lower drones. Data suggested the Tyrannex began registering humans not as another species, but as predators, outside their food chain classification. In every theater, humans were the unpredictable factor that unbalanced the war. Not through size, numbers, or technology, but with tenacity, adaptation, and raw aggression filtered through intellect. Their presence altered how every side moved, planned, and survived. They didn't arrive as reinforcements. They came as a force of nature. The war shifted. Slowly at first, then drastically. The lines that once bent under Tyrannex pressure began to hold. Not because of heavier fortifications or advanced weapons, but because humans had turned each front into a crucible. Every inch of ground they took became a lesson in how to make the enemy suffer for every step. They didn't defend, they baited, punished, and countered with precision born from repetition. Other species adapted around them. Not by teaching humans, but by learning from them. Squad formations grew looser. Rigid command structures became flexible. Alien troops began integrating with human units, watching how they moved, how they read terrain, how they treated silence as a weapon. The Deathworlder approach began to spread, not in method, but in mindset. Survive first, question later. Entire doctrines were rewritten. Medical units shortened triage steps, engineers built modular kill boxes, and scouts ditched drones in favor of human-taught stealth tactics. Wherever humans led, casualties dropped. Not because the fighting was easier, but because their instincts translated into fewer mistakes. They didn't follow procedures, they followed outcomes. The Tyrannex felt it first. Their push stalled in sectors where humans took the lead. Their adaptability became counterproductive. Against other enemies, evolution meant victory. Against humans, it just meant the game kept changing. Hive patterns degraded. Internal communications began failing. Swarms turned inward, suspecting interference. Their command structures, once unshakable, started cracking. One unit of humans reportedly used biohacked pheromones from captured drones to trigger friendly fire inside the hive. Not once. Repeatedly. The swarms began collapsing their own tunnels. Panic wasn't in their nature, but confusion was setting in. Not from overwhelming firepower, but from pressure their instincts couldn't solve. They couldn't predict humans, and that made them vulnerable. More than tactics, it was the psychological impact. For every fallen Deathworlder, 5 more took their place, harder and faster. No retreat. No surrender. Even their wounded fought. A human missing a leg held a choke point with a mounted cannon until the barrel overheated. One squad under siege for 4 days didn't call for extraction, they called for more ammunition. Accord strategists started allocating resources based on human activity. Wherever they moved, priorities shifted. Supplies were rerouted to match their insane pace. Forward bases adjusted to their unpredictable schedules. Traditional war zones became secondary. The real war followed wherever humans went. Their mere presence created zones of influence that spread like fire. Alien commanders stopped treating them as auxiliaries. Now they were assets, blunt instruments that cracked impossible targets. Not specialists. Not elites. Just consistent, adaptive, and unstoppable. Diplomats no longer debated Earth's role. That conversation ended the moment humans saved 6 planets by detonating the core of an orbiting Tyrannex berthing vessel with salvaged nuclear material and a stolen jump drive. None of them returned. They didn't expect thanks. They didn't wait for recognition. They rotated back into combat as if sacrifice were routine. For them, it was. Heroes weren't rare, heroism was expected. They didn't brag. They just kept moving. One objective at a time, one target after another, never slowing. Human culture bled into the ranks. Other species began to emulate their grit. Morale saw unexpected spikes. Troops adopted Earth phrases, human music played across makeshift bases, and the phrase, "Send in the Deathworlders," became shorthand for salvation. Not out of romanticism, but because it meant someone was coming who wouldn't break. The turning point wasn't marked by a single victory. It was marked by a shift in tone. The Tyrannics stopped pressing forward. Instead of overwhelming waves, they tested edges, avoided direct engagements, pulled back when humans entered proximity. Fear was never part of their biology. But now, they hesitated. Evolution had limits. And humans kept pushing past them. Not once did humans claim superiority. They simply delivered results. They were blunt, fast, and impossible to anticipate. What made them terrifying wasn't their brutality. It was how calmly they carried it. War didn't define them. They simply understood it better than anyone else. The Accord realized too late that Earth had never been backward. It had been waiting. Watching. Training for a universe that had grown too soft to remember what real danger looked like. When called, they didn't argue. They deployed. Not as soldiers. As Deathworlders who turned extinction into resistance. They never asked what came next. Victory wasn't a goal, it was just the next requirement. When the war turned, and the Tyrannics began retreating in fractured patterns, humans didn't stop. They pressed harder. While the Accord debated treaties and future stabilization, Deathworlders tore through remnants like they were cleaning up a mess they refused to leave behind. They weren't vindictive, they were thorough. The remains of the swarm became scattered and disorganized, but humans didn't relax. They treated scattered nests with the same urgency as full-blown offensives. They didn't wait for intelligence reports. They became the intelligence. Recon, assault, demolition, they blurred every line. Entire squads disappeared into the vacuum of forgotten sectors, only to return weeks later with maps, enemy samples, and high-value targets neutralized. No support. No backup. Just relentless execution. Accord forces were exhausted, but humans moved like something still unfinished. They didn't celebrate. No commemorations, no parades, no speeches. What others called the end of war, they treated as unfinished business. Even when offered rest, they volunteered for frontier clearance, tunnel sweeps, minefield neutralization. There was no off switch. They simply didn't recognize peace the way others did. Alien diplomats and command councils tried to pull them back, concerned about escalation, political fallout, regional destabilization. The humans listened, nodded, and kept working. Not because they disrespected authority, but because the fight wasn't done. Survivors from infested colonies were still missing. Tyrannics' growth spores were still out there. They didn't consider it war anymore. It was maintenance. Their reputation shifted from dangerous to necessary. Planets that once viewed them as unpredictable now refused to defend themselves without human advisors. Colonists requested Deathworlder liaisons. Civilian infrastructure projects were amended to include human input for defense design. Even trade hubs welcomed former soldiers as peacekeepers. Not because they brought comfort, but because they brought consequences. Many humans never returned to Earth. Some couldn't. They'd seen too much, adapted too far. They remained stationed across liberated zones, acting as trainers, advisors, sometimes quiet guardians watching from the edge of city ruins. Wherever they stayed, order held. Not from rules, but from the knowledge that these people had faced extinction and refused to blink. Deathworlders weren't raised to seek power. They didn't fight for conquest or status. They fought because losing meant something worse than death. Their resilience wasn't born from strength, but from the understanding that no one would come if they failed. That mindset didn't vanish with victory, it rooted deeper. They weren't soldiers of circumstance. They were cultivators of harsh truth. The Accord quietly studied them. Their biology, behavior, neuropatterns. Reports described them as emotionally volatile, yet psychologically unbreakable. Their trauma rates were high, but recovery rates were even higher. They processed horror not by denial, but by facing it directly. Where other species crumbled, humans endured by turning suffering into fuel. Pain didn't destroy them, it sharpened their edge. Across war memorials, many refused to place human statues. They said it felt wrong to immortalize people who hadn't stopped moving. Tributes were instead woven into systems, long-range scanners, encrypted protocols, underground bunkers named after fallen squads. Quiet acknowledgments. Functional legacies. Exactly how they would have preferred it. In classified files, there were stories no one dared publish. A human walking through a biowarped trench to recover a child. A scout squad sacrificing air support to drag wounded aliens 10 kilometers uphill. A single operator cutting a path through 300 drones without backup because no one else could reach the evac point. No medals. No announcements. Just mission complete. What remained of the Tyrannics scattered to fringe systems. Their instinct-driven evolution no longer offered advantage. Wherever they hid, human scouts followed. Not to eradicate without cause, but to ensure no one else faced the storm alone. They didn't believe in absolutes. They believed in responsibility. The universe learned to adjust. Deathworlders weren't an anomaly. They were a warning. A reminder that evolution didn't guarantee dominance. It only made you comfortable, until something worse arrived. Something with fire in its lungs and history in its scars. Something that didn't consider survival optional. They hadn't been reinforcements. They were the last answer. The final line drawn in blood and grit. And they had proven, without doctrine or fanfare, that when the worst came screaming out of the void, it wasn't technology or diplomacy that held the line. It was humanity, alone, defiant, and unyielding.